Hello.
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello?
Is this Mrs. Dorothy Letterman?
That's right, Dorothy.
Yes, it is. Who's this?
Are you the mother of David Letterman who does Late Night on NBC?
There was no dramatic banishment, no public announcement, no furious speech from behind the desk. That was the genius of it, and for some people, the cruelty of it. One day you were in the orbit of the most powerful man in television, and the next day the chair was simply no longer yours. The invitation never came. Your name stopped circulating. The phone felt quieter. And because this was Johnny Carson, the silence did all the work. To understand how terrifying that silence could be, you have to remember what The Tonight Show meant in America before the internet scattered attention into 1,000 little fragments. This was not just another stop on a publicity tour. This was the cathedral of late night, the final national ritual before bed, the one place where millions of people still watched together, laughed together, and quietly agreed on who mattered. Carson sat at the center of it with that familiar ease, the relaxed grin, the perfect pause, the feeling that nothing could rattle him. But that calm presence masked a truth people inside the business understood very well. The desk was not just a piece of furniture. It was a checkpoint between obscurity and relevance. If Johnny liked you, your life could move in a single night. If he didn't, doors didn't necessarily slam. They just stopped opening. That's why the most revealing stories about Carson are not really about jokes at all. They are about power, about who got lifted, who got frozen out, and what happened when personal hurt collided with national influence. No story captures that more sharply than Joan Rivers, because hers was not the tale of a random guest who went too far. She was not an outsider throwing rocks at the king. She was the insider, the protege, the woman he put in front of America and helped turn into a star. And when that relationship broke, it didn't break loudly. It broke in the Carson style, with cold finality. But Joan's story is only the doorway into something larger, because once you start looking closely at Carson's reign, you find a pattern that says more about Hollywood than any scandal ever could. The same man who made millions feel comfortable had an uncanny ability to make colleagues nervous. The same host who could rescue a young comic with a laugh could also make seasoned performers wonder whether a misstep, a betrayal, or even a bruised ego would get them quietly erased from a room. That is the contradiction at the center of Johnny Carson's legend, and it is why his story is still so magnetic. He wasn't just the king of late night. He was the gate, the weather, the mood of the industry itself. And if you want to understand why one disappeared guest chair mattered so much, you first have to understand how a single wave from Johnny Carson could feel like a coronation. The scale of that power is almost hard to explain now, because modern celebrity moves too fast and too many places at once. In Carson's era, fame still had choke points, and The Tonight Show was the biggest one in entertainment. Over 3 decades, more than 4,500 episodes, and roughly 23,000 guests turned Carson into a nightly force of habit, a man seen by more people on more occasions than almost anyone in American history. At his peak, he was drawing around 15 million viewers a night, which meant one good appearance didn't just introduce you to an audience. It repositioned you inside the culture. Comedians spoke about it the way athletes talk about a call-up to the majors. David Brenner remembered going on with almost nothing in his pocket and waking up to real money, real offers, a real career. Stephen Wright called it a fairy tale. Burt Reynolds said that in the 60s and 70s, if you went on Carson and scored, you were hotter than fire the next morning. That was the Carson wave, the little gesture that told America, and more importantly Hollywood, this person belongs. Sit down at the couch, get the interview, make Johnny laugh, and the entire business suddenly treated you differently. And Carson understood that power intimately because he had built the late-night blueprint so effectively that the show itself started to feel like a natural law. The monologue, the desk chat, the sketch, the celebrity interview, the comic set that might end in a career-making invitation to the couch. He didn't invent every ingredient, but he perfected the rhythm. More than that, he mastered a particular kind of control. Carson rarely seemed to strain for dominance because he didn't need to. He had the camera. He had timing. He had the audience's trust. He could be generous without surrendering command, spontaneous without looking messy, warm without becoming available. That last part mattered. Even people who adored him often described him as distant. He could make you feel welcomed on air while remaining sealed off the moment the camera stopped. Guests learned not to confuse on-screen chemistry with actual closeness. Carson protected himself with professionalism, routine, and a kind of emotional insulation that made his public charm even more potent. He was the friendliest man in America after 11:30, and by many accounts, one of the hardest men in entertainment to truly know. That split helped create the mystique, but it also created danger. Because if you cannot read the private man, you cannot always tell when you have wounded him. And once the wound was there, the consequences could be wildly disproportionate to the offense. That is exactly what made Joan Rivers fall so devastating. She knew the stage, knew the rhythm, knew the empire from the inside. She had spent years proving she was not just another guest passing through, which is why what happened next felt less like a booking dispute and more like a royal exile. Joan Rivers had fought too hard to mistake opportunity for security. Before Carson, she spent years grinding through clubs, cabarets, and rooms that barely deserved the name stage. She auditioned repeatedly for The Tonight Show, got turned down repeatedly, and by the mid-60s was already hearing the kind of career obituary talk the business loves to hand women early. Then came February 1965. She went on Carson, the set caught fire, and he delivered the sentence every comedian dreams of hearing: "You're going to be a star." For Rivers, that was not just praise, it was ignition. The phone started ringing. The industry suddenly saw what it had ignored. She became a regular, then a writer, then one of the show's most trusted guest hosts, and eventually Carson's permanent guest host. To the audience, they looked almost mythic together. The king and the sharp-tongued heir apparent who could keep the room alive when he was away. But what Rivers understood, maybe too late, was that being cherished inside Carson's kingdom was not the same thing as being free of it. By the mid-80s, Fox came to her with a dazzling proposition: her own late-night show, a chance to become the first woman to host a major network-style late-night program under her own name. She had stayed loyal for years while others spun off into their own projects. NBC had not made her Carson's future successor. In fact, reports later made clear she wasn't even on the network's real shortlist. So she took the leap. And then came the fatal mistake, or the fatal perception. Carson found out before she could truly tell him the way he felt he should have been told. Rivers later said the first person she called was Johnny, that he hung up on her and never ever spoke to her again. He denied she called. She insisted she did. However you frame the disputed phone call, the ending is not in dispute. The relationship was over. Completely. Permanently. Rivers would later say she thought he felt betrayed, and at times suggested something even more unsettling, that he could accept male protégés leaving to do their own shows, but experienced her departure as a personal act of disobedience. Whether that interpretation is fair or not, the aftermath was brutal. She vanished from Tonight for decades. The ban outlived Carson's tenure and continued through Jay Leno's. Rivers later said she was iced out across late night. Accounts from the period describe a chilling effect around her Fox show, with fears that appearing there could close off Carson's couch. Then the professional disaster became personal catastrophe. Fox turned chaotic. Her husband Edgar Rosenberg, who had joined the venture as producer, clashed with executives. Rivers was eventually fired from her own show. Rosenberg died by suicide months later. She would rebuild because Joan Rivers was too ferocious not to rebuild. But one thing never healed. Carson did not soften. She saw him in restaurants and tried to speak. He would not engage. She wrote, hoped, waited. Nothing. It remains one of the coldest endings in entertainment history, not because it exploded, but because it never did. It just stayed frozen. If Joan Rivers was the most heartbreaking example of Carson's silence, Wayne Newton was the example of what happened when the silence turned into jokes. For years, Newton and Carson had a perfectly functional show business relationship. Newton appeared on The Tonight Show many times, smiling the smile, playing the role, moving through the same entertainment ecosystem that linked Vegas glamour to network power. Then business poisoned the air. In 1980, Newton got the upper hand in a bitter battle over ownership tied to the Aladdin in Las Vegas, a property Carson and his partner had wanted. According to Newton, Carson was furious, and soon the fury started leaking into the monologue. These weren't playful little taps. Newton later said Carson began aiming jokes at his masculinity and image, using the desk the way only Carson could use it, casually enough for the audience to laugh, pointedly enough for the target to feel the blade. And that is what made Carson's humor so formidable when he was angry. A joke from almost anyone else was just a joke. A joke from Carson, delivered to millions from the most authoritative chair in late night, could alter how people in the business talked about you the next morning. Newton claimed he tried for years to get through to him, then finally walked into Carson's office and told him to stop. The jokes reportedly stopped. The friendship did not recover. Newton was never really part of Carson's world again. What makes that feud so revealing is that it strips away the sentimental version of late-night television and shows the machinery underneath. Carson did not need to scream, threaten, or issue decrees. He could make displeasure entertaining. He could turn grievance into a punchline and let the audience's laughter do part of the damage. And once you see that, a lot of the quieter stories around him make more sense. Over the years, various comics and performers described a Tonight Show atmosphere in which approval felt precious precisely because disapproval felt so hard to correct. Some later said they believed impressions of Carson had cost them invitations. Others described the show as a place where surprise, ego collisions, or simple misreadings could have consequences that were never clearly spelled out. That ambiguity was part of the power too. If the rules are unwritten, everybody polices themselves. Everybody studies the mood. Everybody learns to anticipate the taste of one man. This is how an empire preserves itself without ever looking tyrannical. And yet Carson was not merely some petty despot lurking behind a desk. That would be too simple, too easy, and frankly too small for what he actually was. The same man who could punish through distance was also the man who made the whole machine feel graceful, effortless, even necessary. Which leads to the deeper question beneath all the feuds. What kind of person becomes that good at making strangers feel at home while keeping so much of himself inaccessible? The answer, if there is one, lives in the split between Johnny Carson, the performer, and Johnny Carson, the person. On camera, he was one of the most complete hosts television has ever produced. Cool without arrogance, generous without losing control, funny without seeming desperate for the laugh. He could rescue a weak segment, guide an awkward guest, or let chaos bloom just long enough to feel thrilling before pulling it neatly back into shape. Off camera, the accounts become more complicated and darker. Friends, biographers, colleagues, and those who loved him all circle the same basic paradox. He was private to the point of opacity, shy in a way that could look like aloofness, and often more comfortable performing intimacy than living it. One writer described it almost like two bodies. The television Carson, charming and beloved, and the private Carson, distant, volatile, sometimes impossible. He himself admitted something close to that truth, saying that in front of an audience he could be in control, and off stage he was aloof because he was not very comfortable. That need for control seems to connect everything. It is there in the way he ran the show. It is there in the way he handled relationships. It is there in the grudges that could last decades, in the emotional quarantine people felt around him, and in the personal life that looked far less polished than the tuxedoed figure America welcomed each night. Carson married 4 times. There were reports of infidelity, heavy drinking, temper, and long stretches of emotional absence. His home life never achieved the elegance of his television timing. He could reduce chaos on stage, but he rarely mastered off stage. Even the stories of affection around him often come with qualifiers, as if love had to pass through a layer of static before reaching him. The hardest chapter may have been family. One of his sons, Rick, died in a car accident in 1991, a loss that visibly wounded him near the end of his run. Viewers who had spent decades seeing the immaculate host suddenly glimpsed something raw beneath the polish. Then, in 1992, he did something almost nobody at his level ever manages to do. He left. Not half left. not retired while shopping for the next spotlight. He walked away after 4,531 episodes and an estimated 50 million viewers for his final broadcast, then spent the next years largely refusing the culture that kept begging for one more look. When he finally gave a rare retirement interview, he said he had left at the right time and wanted the work to speak for itself. That was vintage Carson, elegant, controlled, withholding. He had spent 30 years owning the national night, and then he vanished so completely that the disappearance itself became part of the legend. But absence, whether on a booking sheet or in public life, meant something different when Carson created it. His absences always carried intention. That is why Johnny Carson's story still feels bigger than nostalgia. It is not only the story of a master host or a vanished television era, or even a few wounded celebrities who found themselves on the wrong side of his pride. It is the story of how entertainment power used to work when one person, one platform, and one mood at one desk could shape careers with astonishing force. Carson didn't just dominate late night. He defined the emotional grammar of it. Every host who followed inherited some piece of his structure, from a monologue to the desk, from the guest chat to the delicate dance of seeming spontaneous while controlling everything. You can trace his fingerprints through Letterman's irreverence, Leno's accessibility, Fallon's eagerness, Kimmel's timing, and almost every modern comic's idea of what it means to break on television. But his true legacy is more unsettling than imitation. He proved that charisma and distance can coexist so seamlessly that the audience experiences one while never noticing the other. He proved that a television host could be both comfort figure and power broker, both national companion and private riddle. And he proved that the most effective form of control in show business is often not confrontation, but omission. Don't yell at someone. Don't announce the punishment. Just remove the light. That is what made the Joan Rivers story so haunting. It wasn't just about two comedians who never reconciled. It was about a woman who helped define Carson's era and still could not breach the wall once he decided the story was over. It is what makes the Wayne Newton feud linger too, because it showed how easily a late-night laugh could become a weapon when aimed from that desk. And yet the final twist in Carson's story is that even the people who felt the coldest side of him often still recognized the scale of his talent. Rivers herself, despite everything, never stopped acknowledging what he had done for her in 1965. That is the trap of greatness like his. It complicates blame without erasing consequence. Carson was not a monster, and he was not a saint. He was something more durable and more interesting. A magician who understood audiences better than almost anyone, a private man who built the most public ritual of his age, a kingmaker who could bless and banish with almost the same gesture. So when people remember the empty chairs and the vanished invitations, they are remembering more than gossip. They are remembering what it looked like when American television had a single sovereign, and how much warmth and damage one smile could hide.